Another significant composer of the modern era was Igor Stravinsky. He was born into a musical family in Russia. He studied composition with Rimsky-Korsakov until the latter's death in 1908. Many scholars and historians divide his compositional output into three eras, similar to Beethoven. But different from Beethoven is that they're not divided based on early, middle, and late, but by the stylistic influence that's present. His first is the Russian period, then the neoclassical period, and finally the serial period. Stravinsky finds his place as a professional composer with much thanks to the Ballet Russe, a formidable Russian dance company. This is very much part of Stravinsky's Russian era, for in 1909 he is recruited by the impresario Sergei Diaghilev to compose a ballet for the 1910 season of the Ballet Russe. And this ballet is The Firebird, which draws from a fund of Russian folk and fairy tales about a hero, Prince Ivan, and King Koshchei, sometimes known as King Koshchei the Deathless. It was a great success for the troupe and secured Stravinsky's reputation as a composer. You can see the original costume for King Koshchei on the right. Many thanks to my former graduate assistants, Martha Schulenberg, for taking this photo and for help with this presentation. One remarkable element about the Firebird is how Stravinsky uses the Rimsky-Korsakov-like technique of characterizing human characters with diatonic melodies and otherworldly creatures with octatonic and whole tone scales. Here, the princesses are represented by a diatonic melody, while the Firebird, Koshchei, and the king's retinue are depicted with more exotic harmonies. The Ballet Russe plays an integral part in the development of musical art in 20th century Europe. In many ways, it changes the course of 20th century art. Dancers such as Nijinsky, pictured at the left, Fokine, Balanchine, and Massine choreographed groundbreaking ballets, such as Satie's Parade, Stravinsky's Firebird and Rite of Spring, Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, and many other avant-garde works, securing them a place in the cultural consciousness. Other composers who worked with the company include no less than Prokofiev, Ravel, Milhaud, Poulenc, Auric, and Richard Strauss. On the right, you can see a picture of the original Firebird costume from the 1910 production. Now, remember Nijinsky, who's pictured here on the left. As we move on, we see that Stravinsky will adopt a new style that becomes known as primitivism for his ballet Le Sacre du Printemps, that is, the Rite of Spring. Following the Firebird, Stravinsky composed Petrushka for the ballet, and in 1913 created his piece The Rite of Spring. Here he collaborated with the Russian painter Nicholas Roerich for the scenery, and Nijinsky, who we saw pictured before, choreographed the ballet. Both Stravinsky's score and Nijinsky's choreography were both equally shocking to the dancers, and likely to the audience. Far from the graceful movements that were present in traditional ballets, Stravinsky's choreography incorporated jumping and sharp movements. You can actually find a reproduction of the original ballet with its movements in several YouTube videos. Indeed, this performance was meant to depict a tribal community in pre-Christian Russia who were sacrificing a maiden to renew the fertility of the soil. The idea that Stravinsky was getting at here was called primitivism, where artists were drawing from non-Western or pagan concepts of people, or at least as they understood those concepts. Stravinsky's ballet The Wedding, Les Noces, depicts a Russian village wedding and is also considered primitivist. What Stravinsky's trying to do here is get at certain roots of what it is to be Russian. Here's an excerpt from The Rite of Spring. This is from part one, The Adoration of the Earth. We'll listen to a few minutes of this and pay attention, even though this is a two piano reduction, you'll notice that the beginning just uses woodwinds and wind instruments. So we have a sort of saturated color here. Without the strings, there's a certain primal sense that we have. Also, that C that we hear at the beginning is actually played in a bassoon. This writing is very high for many of the bassoons at the time. There is some discussion about whether the French bassoons could more easily reach that high note, but whether or not it was a French bassoon or a bassoon of another make, that note is rather high and would have been slightly odd to hear as the opening note of a ballet played in a very high register of a rather colorful or nasal sounding instrument. So not only do we have a sense of otherness there in the orchestration, we also are pushing the performer beyond where they were comfortable before. Much of modernist music, whether we're looking at the Second Viennese School or at Stravinsky or at other composers in the early 20th century, much of this music will push players and ensembles outside of their comfort zones, making them play strange rhythms, mixtures of time signatures, as you see here, or playing the instrument in odd ways that they're not used to. This is going to push ensembles and performers to be increasingly virtuosic when it comes to world premieres. Here is the opening few minutes of Le Sacre de Printemps, The Rite of Spring. You can see how the dancers and the audience were likely surprised by this seemingly brutal music. In fact, after the performance, there was a riot. There's been a lot of talk about the riot surrounding the Rite of Spring. Part of this may have been due to the fact that it was perhaps not what the audience was expecting, but there was also a tradition of uproar surrounding new works in Paris at the time. So, in some ways, this was fulfilling almost a cultural function of being radical. At the same time, it does offer some really juicy, strange harmonic events. We heard some of those in the introduction, and in this driving section that we just finished, we heard that Le Sacre chord, an F flat major chord in the left hand with a E flat major minor 7 in first inversion above it. F flat, A flat, C flat, F flat in the left hand, and G natural, B flat, D flat, E flat. That's where we get that melody. Yum bum 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 from that upper part of that chord. We also hear here Stravinsky's block-like writing style. It's almost like a collage. It's like he takes one element and cuts it out of a piece of paper and then pastes another element alongside it and gradually builds up. Some theorists talk about Stravinsky making a compositional style out of the inability to write transitions. It seems here that one event jumps to the next rather rapidly. Though there are some subtle connections, this is an interesting way to look at his music, to see those abrupt jump cuts between sections and between ideas. After the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky and Diaghilev collaborated on a ballet that Diaghilev wanted to be drawn from music by Pergolesi. The resulting piece was called Pulcinella, and it began what is now termed the neoclassical movement. This is where composers endeavored to evoke classical and Baroque styles. After the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky and Diaghilev collaborated on a ballet that Diaghilev wanted to be drawn from music by Pergolesi. You might remember Pergolesi from La Serva Padrona that we looked at back in all the way back in module 5. After the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky and Diaghilev collaborated on a ballet that Diaghilev wanted to be drawn from music by Pergolesi. The resulting piece was titled Pulcinella, and it began what is known as the neoclassical movement. This is where composers endeavored to evoke classical and even Baroque styles in their music. At this time, the Parisian public was tired of folk-inspired tunes, and the blend of classical form and harmony, along with modern techniques, yielded music that could be complex but organized, and therefore appealing to audiences at the time. The ballet Pulcinella drew its characters again from the Italian Commedia dell'arte. We saw that in Pierrot Lunaire. Remember, the Commedia dell'arte was a comedy style using stock tropes, using stock characters that appeared again and again in the different plays. Pulcinella is essentially the character of Punch, if you're familiar with Punch and Judy. He is, in some ways, a comic character, slightly tragic, but also grotesque. This coincided with the original music that was falsely attributed to Pergolesi. Other significant works from this period in Stravinsky's career include the Symphony in C, the Violin Concerto, and the Symphony of Psalms. By the 1950s, Stravinsky began to adapt his style to what was considered more fashionable by the younger generation of European composers. One was Pierre Boulez in particular. This was evident in such works like The Rake's Progress, the Requiem Canticles, and Argo. Much of Stravinsky's serial music uses serialism rather loosely. It's not the tight serialism that we see in the Second Viennese School, and certainly not what we see with Webern. But it is a dive into the serial style. In fact, you may recall that I mentioned that Stravinsky actually lives down the street from Schoenberg at the time. They both moved to California for a period later in their lives. Although this output from 1951 to 71 is considered the serial period, not all music he wrote was actually serialist. For one, his Momentum pro Gesualdo de Venosa, which were instrumental arrangements of Gesualdo songs, is definitely not serialist, but rather lifting Gesualdo's music. Remember Gesualdo, that strange chromatic Renaissance composer, and putting them in an instrumental context. Stravinsky also apocryphally said, "Good composers borrow, great composers steal." This is an interesting idea and has certainly had issues, has created issues within the 20th and 21st centuries. But this is one of Stravinsky's examples, perhaps not stealing, but certainly paying homage to, taking songs from the Renaissance and reorchestrating them. It makes particular sense that he was interested in these strange harmonic styles of Gesualdo. Stravinsky's later works often had biblical themes, such as Abraham and Isaac, as well as the flood. Though Stravinsky's music is a product of the 20th century, he is seen by some as a composer rooted in the older music traditions, from which so many other composers of the time strove to break away. Even when he moved to a serialist style, it was because that was, quote-unquote, what the cool kids were doing at the time. Compared to musicians like Henry Cowell or Charles Ives, Stravinsky is arguably less controversial in some of his techniques. Arguably, Stravinsky's contributions to music come from both his compositional output and from the boundaries that his music pushed, pushing performers to be on their game in terms of technique and coordination and being open to some new ideas. Performatively, his music demanded much more from musicians than other repertoire, resulting in more and more skilled players.